The last interview is entitled, Draw Lessons Quickly and Sound a Warning to Others. Mr. Kunihiro talks with Samuel Pisar, author of Blood and Hope.
Dr. Pisar, it seems to me, and I could be wrong, that the Soviets are exercising a considerable amount of self-restraint in Poland. What accounts, in your view, for the self-restraint that they seem to be exercising?
There is considerable self-restraint because at this stage the Soviets cannot really do anything else. They would very much like the Polish events to disappear, but it's very difficult, and I think it's too late, because now it is really a popular movement. It is widespread among the workers, the intellectuals, and the people generally who, as you know, are very Catholic, very religious, and very devoted to the Church. If the Soviets were at this moment to walk in with the Red Army, I think there would be a tremendous bloodbath. Not because the Polish army would resist as an army, but there would be many unruly units of the Polish army, many splinter sections that would go to the forests and would resist. And that is the kind of bloodbath the Russians are not willing to get into at this stage, because it could spread very quickly to other parts of their bloc. I think they will do it, no matter what the price, in very extreme circumstances.
What would you say is the role that is played by the Polish Pope in the first place, and by Mr. Wałęsa and his labor organization in terms of discouraging the Russians from marching in?
Well, the Polish people are a very romantic, hot-blooded people. And at the present time, they are particularly heated up because in the last few years they have given the world a pope, a Nobel Prize of Literature, and a liberator, Wałęsa. Yet I'm also impressed by the restraint. They seem to have found in this combination of Wałęsa, who heads up the Solidarity Trade Union, and the primate of the Catholic Church in Poland, who I'm sure is in constant contact with the Pope in Rome, a kind of a thin line that they know they can move up to, but not transgress. They are constantly on the trapeze, like in a circus, but the thing is impressive in its control and restraint. I think they realize that the transformation of Polish society must progress gradually, that it must not get out of control, that the Russians will tolerate a certain amount of freedom, perhaps economic freedom and closer trade and business relations with the West, because that makes much more sense for the Poles than to be constrained within a sterile communist economy that is not going anywhere. But they also know that if they were to transgress to such a point that it would look to the Russians as if Poland is leaving the security system, the military alliance of the Warsaw Pact, leaving behind a big hole, a big vacuum in that security system. At that point, the Soviet generals would march in at any price and bring a stop.
It seems to me that the Polish people have been able to gain a large measure of political freedom, thanks largely perhaps to Mr. Wałęsa and so on. And it seems to me that the Polish economy is still in very bad shape. Now, do you think that the Polish economy will be able to come out of the woods, and if so, under what circumstances?
I don't think the Polish economy will be able to come out of the woods unless two things happen. One, the Polish people must go back to work. At the present time, they're not really working. There is excitement in the air, and they are agitating. They don't have enough food. They don't have enough material possessions, and they want more freedom. And everyone is in a kind of a psychological state of effervescence, which is not very conducive to getting down to the job at hand. Secondly, I don't think Poland could ever become even a reasonably prosperous economy and country within the communist system. It is absolutely clear today that the communist system, as an economic system, is condemned. It is sterile. It doesn't work in agriculture. The communist countries, even Russia itself, cannot feed itself. The industry doesn't work. There are all kinds of problems. The events in Poland began because housewives could not buy meat, could not buy clothing. There was nothing available. And that is an endemic, chronic problem of communist economics. So if Poland is to progress economically, it would have to develop business relations with Japan, with Western Europe, with the United States, and it would have to liberalize, at least to some extent, its economy, but always, of course, within the limits of remaining part of the Soviet bloc, because the Soviet Union will not tolerate a complete political and strategic transformation. Communism cannot economically solve the Polish problem.
To change the subject slightly, Dr. Pisar, years ago you authored a book entitled Coexistence and Commerce, which I understand had the title of Weapons of Peace in its European edition. But you have always dwelt upon the importance of commercial relations as a means of bringing about a better measure of peaceful coexistence between the West and the East. But there are some pessimistic souls, perhaps including myself, that your policy orientation of coexistence and commerce is in for a rather bitter winter under the Reagan administration, which seems to be taking such a big stick policy vis-à-vis the Eastern Bloc. Now, how would you counter this line of argument?
In my present book, The Blood of Hope,
Yes.
I come back to this subject. Because I don't go into the same intellectual analysis as in the former book, but in a human way I'm trying to pose the dangers of the East-West confrontation. And I am suggesting some kind of approaches on how that animosity between East and West could be brought under control and stabilized into a form of hopefully permanent peace. I believe that what I call coexistence and commerce, and which is really no more than a way of taking the poison out of so-called hereditary enemies through the interaction of economics, of technological cooperation, of industrial cooperation, and of commerce generally. That construction of a web of commercial and human contacts between so-called enemies is the best cure for the tensions, because it gives both sides an interest in the process and because it is based on their reciprocal self-interest. Now, at the present time, you're quite right in pointing out the tensions are on the increase. And Mr. Reagan is waving the big stick. And that is because I think that in the Carter years, American policy was unclear. Mr. Carter did not really know what he wanted in that area. He had constantly, in relation to the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc generally, one foot on the accelerator and one foot on the brake. President Reagan is trying to establish a policy of firmness to refurbish the American military establishment, which needed refurbishment because it had been neglected. But I am convinced that when this initial process is settled, Mr. Reagan will return to a policy that is not only firm, but also open. I see no hope for the future unless we follow a policy of firmness, but at the same time of openness, in order to transform this relationship into something safer for everybody and more constructive. And allow me to point out that it is precisely conservative presidents that came from the right that have been able to practice a policy of détente and cooperation more easily, because leaders who come from the left are always suspected. So you had openings of that kind that have been begun by Eisenhower, who was a Republican, by Nixon, who was the greatest communist biter of all, and now by Reagan, who is still on the Cold Warish path, but I think which he will inevitably modulate to open up both negotiations for SALT and the limitation of strategic arms, and also, I hope, for the development of trade and economic cooperation, and his recent decision to abandon the embargo on the exportation of agricultural products of wheat to the Soviet Union is already a symptom of that kind of a tendency.
Well, if that is the case, Dr. Pisar, as you know, the Reagan administration has been trying to influence us into stepping up our military capability to a very considerable extent. If that is the case, then would you say that we should be rather careful not to climb on the Reagan arms increase bandwagon too hastily?
My opinion on it is, I think, very clear. I think that Japan belongs in the Western Alliance. Japan is an ally of the United States. Japan's security is inevitably linked up with the United States today, and Japan must therefore play its weight in the alliance. Now, at the same time, given the historic experience of Japan, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and that crushing defeat of the last World War, I think Japan should be very careful not to embark itself on the development of nuclear weapons, on the proliferation of nuclear weapons. One of the reasons I wrote The Blood of Hope is because I myself have gone through a Holocaust. I sometimes think that in my childhood, when I was a prisoner at Auschwitz, I saw a vision of some kind of a future thermonuclear Auschwitz, thermonuclear Hiroshima. And that has perhaps given me a very peculiar point of view. But I think that the Japanese people know something, I know something about the capability of man for suicide and self-destruction that most people don't know. And we have an obligation to draw those lessons a little more quickly than others and to sound a warning to others. And at the same time, and there is again something that I would like to stress because I see in it a kind of a personal affinity with Japan and with its people. Japan must also feed that component of Western foreign policy which, while it is firm and it is giving due weight to security considerations, must also seek an opening of relations. And in that context, coexistence, commerce, trade, cooperation is something which the Japanese people are very good at, and they have fulfilled in the last few decades a very important function. It is really what I call in this new book, Weapons of Peace, and I think Japan has played this game and followed this policy with friend and enemy alike, and I think that this is the hope of the future. We must place our confidence not only in an arms race for the security of the future, but also in the courage, inventiveness, the capacity of the human being to endure, to create. And if man has until now, in moments of great crisis, in very difficult times, survived, it was by his courage, by his decency, and by his belief in the audacity of the mind. I think this is my personal story. It is also, I think, the story of modern Japan.
I understand that you and your family are going to take a trip to Hiroshima tomorrow, and as a Japanese, I would like to express my very heartfelt appreciation to you for the trip. And the final question I have in mind is, after you went through what you went through at Auschwitz, what would you be the message that you'd like to get across to the rest of humanity, or maybe to the Japanese in particular? I think you have covered this already, but would you add maybe a word or two?
My pilgrimage to Hiroshima with my wife and my 3 children is really a meditation about the dangers and the hopes that are facing the world of today. The single message I would like to get across is that the world stands at the threshold of an apocalypse. And where, if not from Auschwitz, where, if not from Hiroshima, can come the warning to humanity that this is the moment to meditate and to understand and to look for a new way, a way of hope, and I think it is the essential message of my book. This is why I have called it Of Blood and Hope, that survival is possible, that peace is possible, and that coexistence and cooperation, even among the so-called hereditary enemies, is possible and essential in order to ensure the future for ourselves and for our children.